Calla Mercer did not sleep the night after they put her grandfather in the ground. She lay in the dark and listened. The house had its own sounds. The creak of the floorboards in the hall when the temperature dropped. The tick of the kitchen clock that Angus Mercer had wound every Sunday morning for 40 years without fail. The sound of Buck's slow breathing outside her door. She lay there and waited for the other sounds, the ones that were gone. Boots crossing the linoleum floor before sunrise. The percolator knocking on the burner. Her grandfather's low hum, not a song, never quite a song, just a sound he made when he was thinking low and tuneless, and as steady as water moving through rock. The silence where those sounds used to be was its own kind of weight. It pressed down on the ceiling and the walls and the dark behind her eyes, and she lay under it and understood for the first time what people meant when they said a house felt empty. It was not that the rooms were bare. Everything was still there. His chair at the table, his coffee mug on the second shelf, the coat with the cracked collar that he had worn every morning since she was 4 years old, hanging on its peg by the back door like he had just stepped out. It was that none of it moved anymore. She got up before the sky lightened because staying down was worse than getting up. She dressed in the dark the same way he had taught her. No lights until you need them. Your eyes adjust if you give them time. The ranch does not wait for daylight, and neither should you. Outside the land was gray and still. 4 years of drought had burned the grass down to wire and cracked the stock tanks into rings of pale mud. The cottonwood at the corner of the house had lost half its leaves 2 months early. Everything that could leave had been leaving since the rain stopped. She went to the barn first, then to the stock tank. The float valve had stuck again overnight and she worked it loose with both hands, her knuckles white in the cold morning air. And when it gave, she stood and watched the water level and tried not to think about how much remained. 7 cows left. There had been 43 when she was 12. Her grandfather had sold them off one small group at a time over the dry years, each sale quieter than the last, until what remained was this handful of old animals that had nowhere else to go and nothing to recommend them except that they were still alive. Same as the ranch, same as all of them. Buck appeared at her side without a sound the way he always had. He was 11 years old, gray around his muzzle, and slow in the mornings, moving on joints that had given him trouble since last winter. He had been her grandfather's dog for 9 years before he became anyone else's. Since the funeral, he had been sleeping across the threshold of Calla's door. Not inside, not outside. Just across it like he was holding the line between the two. She scratched behind his ear. He pressed into her hand once, then went to stand by the water trough and watched the cows with a professional dignity that had not left him even as everything else aged. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, her mother was on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. Petra Mercer held one out, and Calla took it and did not say anything for a while. They stood together and looked out at the dead land in the dying windmill, and the long brown slope of the mountain in the distance, and the cottonwood on the upper pasture that was still impossibly still green. That tree had been green all 4 years of the drought. It was the only green thing on the whole eastern face of the mountain. Calla had stopped trying to explain it. "He's coming today," her mother said. Calla knew who she meant. "I know. He called yesterday while you were in the barn, wanted to pay his respects first, said he could come back another time if we needed it." He didn't wait for an answer. Her mother looked into her mug. No, he didn't. Wade Elspeth arrived at 10 in the morning in a truck that was too clean for the road that led to it. White, recent model, the kind of vehicle that had never been asked to pull anything out of anything. He came down the drive slowly, which Calla noticed, and parked well back from the house, which she also noticed. He climbed out with his hat already in his hands. He was somewhere near 50, built like a man who had spent years at a desk after spending his first decade outdoors. Broad in the shoulder, careful in his movements. He wore a gray jacket and clean boots, and he walked to the porch with the particular ease of someone who had learned to cross thresholds that did not belong to him without appearing to force anything. "Mrs. Mercer." He took Petra's hand in both of his. "I'm truly sorry about Angus. He was a man who knew this land. You don't find that anymore." He turned to Calla and extended his hand, and she shook it. Miss Mercer, I know the timing is hard. I wouldn't have come today at all, but the county moves on the tax rolls at the end of the month, and I'd rather you heard the numbers from me than from a letter. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Calla had eaten every meal of her life. Wade Elspeth set a folder on the oilcloth and drew out a single page and placed it face up between them. A number circled in blue pen. Calla looked at it. It was more money than she had ever seen written next to the name Mercer. It was also, she understood without being told, a number built for people who had already run out of other options. Not what the land was worth. What the land was worth to someone who knew you had no one else to call. That covers the back taxes, the note at First Valley, and leaves you something to start over with, Wade said. His voice was even and not unkind. That was the part she did not trust. The kindness. I won't tell you it's what this place would have sold for in a wet year. It isn't. But it's a dry valley, Mrs. Mercer. The aquifer report from 2012 said the same thing it said in 2004. The water's gone. It's not a failing on anyone's part. It's just the country changing. The Harwick place signed, Petra said. It was not a question. Last week, they're moving to be near family. He paused just long enough. There's no shame in it. Sometimes the most honest thing a person can do for their children is to stop fighting a fight that finished before they walked in. Calla felt that one landed on her mother the way a stone lands in still water. She watched the ripple move across Petra's face. She stood up. My grandfather said there's water. The room went still. Wade Elspeth looked at her. The look was patient and not condescending, and somehow that made it worse. Miss Mercer. He turned the hat in his hands. Your grandfather was a man who cared deeply about this place. I don't doubt that. But he spent the last years of his life on something that the county, the state, and 2 independent hydrological surveys said wasn't there. I knew Angus a little. Good man. But wanting something to be true doesn't make it so. Go check the cows, Petra said quietly. I already checked the cows. Check them again. She went outside. She sat on the flatbed of the old truck with Buck until the white vehicle turned at the end of the drive and raised its banner of dust, heading back toward the highway. Then she went in, and her mother was still at the table with the circled number in front of her, not looking at it and not putting it away. I'm not signing today, Petra said before Calla could speak. She pressed the tips of her fingers together. But Calla, look at what we have. Look at what we don't have. He's wrong about the water. Your grandfather believed that his whole life, and it cost this family everything he had. I loved him. Her voice was careful. But I watched him spend the last years. His mind was sharp, chasing something nobody else could find. And I watched what that did to him. And I will not do that to you. Calla did not say anything. She went to her room and sat on the floor with Buck's heavy head in her lap and felt the weight of the whole Brown Valley pressing down through the roof and the walls and the floor until she was just a person sitting on linoleum with a dog and a house full of things that used to be her life. Her grandfather had not been foolish. That was the part nobody would let her say out loud. Angus Mercer had run a surveyor's license for 30 years before she was born. He had set the corner markers for half the ranches in the valley. He had read this land the way other men read weather, by the way it leaned by, where the rock nosed up and where it dove back under by what grew where nothing else would grow. People had come to him for years to find the right spot to sink a well, and he had been right more times than was comfortable until the year the big report came out of the state and said the aquifer was exhausted. After that, being right about anything else did not count for much. The paper had a government stamp and a company's letterhead, and after that it was gospel. She remembered being 14, walking the high pasture with him in the dead middle of August. Everything dead in every direction. And up on the brown shoulder of the mountain, one cottonwood standing full and green like the drought was happening to someone else. He had stopped walking and pointed at it. Said, a cottonwood cannot live on air, Calla. There is no surface water on that slope, no spring visible to anyone. That tree has been there since my grandfather was a boy, and it has not once, not in any dry year anyone can name, gone brown. It has its feet in something, something that doesn't come and go with the rain. Then he had looked at her with the particular directness of a man saying something he has said many times to people who don't believe him. Said they can stamp all the paper they want. Water doesn't lie. It goes where physics sends it, and it stays where geology holds it. The paper is about what people decided to see. The tree is about what's actually there. She had been 14 and had nodded and believed him the way you believe your grandfather when you were 14. And then she had mostly forgotten it in the way you forget the things you believe before you are old enough to test them. She was 20 now, and she had not forgotten after all. She stayed on the floor for a while. Then she got up and went to her grandfather's room. No one had been able to go in since the funeral home people came. The room was exactly as he had left it. The quilt folded back the way he always folded it, corner to corner. The reading glasses on the nightstand. The pocket knife worn thin from 40 years of opening and closing beside the lamp. A coffee can of buttons and wire and small things he had kept for reasons no one had ever asked about. And in the corner where the people from the funeral home had set it after clearing out the closet was the case. She had known the case all her life. Dark brown leather over wood brass corners, gone green with age, buckles stiff as old bone. The size of a toolbox but heavier, denser. Her grandfather's surveying kit. As a child, she had not been allowed to touch it, which meant she had wanted nothing else on earth. She pulled it out of the corner and worked the buckle loose and lifted the lid. The instruments lay in their felt beds the way they had lain for 30 years. The transit with its spirit level. A folding rule. A compass in a brass case the size of a closed fist. The smell that rose from the felt was mineral and old oil and cedar, and something underneath that was just him, the smell of the man, and she had to stop with her hands on the lid and breathe through it. She breathed through it. Then she looked at the felt liner in the lid. It did not sit flush. She pressed her fingers to the center of it, and it gave slightly the way a surface gives when there is empty space behind it. She worked her thumbnail along the edge and the liner lifted on one side, and behind it was a flat space shallow, maybe half an inch deep. In the space was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a bootlace. Her hands were not steady when she untied it. It was a map, hand-drawn in hard pencil on paper that had gone soft and brown along the folds. She had seen her grandfather's maps before he had made dozens of them over the decades, field surveys for the county property lines, drainage assessments. She knew what his maps looked like. This one was different. It covered the back section of the ranch and the high pasture and the broken country beyond, up toward the eastern face of the mountain. His marks were all over it, the small stamped triangles of benchmarks, the notations in his abbreviated shorthand strings of numbers and letters crowding the margins. And running down out of the mountain, drawn over and over until the pencil line was almost black from repetition, was a single blue line, the only color on the page. He had carried a blue pencil all his years and used it for one thing, for water, for what he was certain of. The blue line came down off the eastern face of the mountain, threading through the broken country, and ended at an X in a fold of terrain Calla recognized by shape, but had never had a reason to enter. The narrow canyon on the far side of the high pasture, the one with the walls that pressed close and the floor you could not see from the ridge above. Beside the X in block letters pressed so hard they had nearly torn the paper. Live water the cistern holds. Calla sat down on the floor of her grandfather's room because her legs had decided that was where she was going. She turned the map over. Folded into the back was a single sheet torn from a field notebook covered in pencil handwriting that she recognized as her grandfather's, but rendered shaky and uneven. The letters starting firm and trailing off the hand of a man whose body had begun to argue with his intentions. She read it. For whoever in this family still has the sense to go looking, the water has not left this valley. They moved the line on purpose. The 2012 report is a lie, and I have enough to show it, but nobody left who will listen to an old man say so. Start where the cottonwood still drinks. The tree knows. Follow it up. Everything is still there exactly where my grandfather built it. It was not signed with a name. It was signed the way Angus Mercer signed everything that mattered, the way he had branded the cattle and stamped his surveys for 40 years. A capital A inside a circle, the Mercer iron. Calla read it twice. Then she looked at the date. He had written it in the spring before the fall when his mind began to go. The spring when his hands were already shaking, but his thinking was still clear. He had known it was coming. He had written this before it arrived. She sat there a long time. Then she got up and went to the window that looked out the back of the house, past the dead windmill that had not turned in 2 years up the long brown slope of the mountain. And there, exactly where it had always been alone, on the dead shoulder of the hill, too far to be anything but a stubborn smear of green against all that brown the cottonwood was still drinking. Gideon Pruitt came by that afternoon. He drove an old whited pickup that had been tan once and was making its slow peace with rust. He climbed out, careful on bad knees with a foil-covered dish balanced in both hands. 74 years old, built like something left out in weather on purpose, wide across the shoulders, and stooped now white stubble on a face that had spent 5 decades in the sun. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent his working life asking the earth to give things up. He had drilled wells in this valley for 40 years before his back made him stop. Before that, for 10 years, he had held the rod for Angus Mercer's surveys. They had been friends for 60 years, which was longer than Calla had been alive, longer than her mother had known either of them. "Brought something," he said when Petra opened the door. "My late wife's recipe. I won't promise it's any good, but it's hot, and it came with good intentions." He stood in the doorway for a moment with his face working. Then he said, "He was the best man I ever had the privilege of arguing with, and I was right about half the time and he was right the other half, and neither of us ever admitted it, and I would give a great deal to have one more argument with him right now." Petra took the dish. She pressed his arm. Calla caught him at his truck 20 minutes later as he was making his slow way back to it. "Mr. Pruitt." He stopped. She had the map and the note. She had tucked them inside her jacket on the way out of the house. She said, "I found something in his case. There was a false back in the lid. I need to know if you can tell me what it means." Gideon Pruitt did not say anything. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the jacket where she had her hand pressed against the hidden shape. She drew out the map. He took it the way you take something fragile, in both hands carefully, the way you'd pick up a bird that had stunned itself against a window. He unfolded it on the hood of his truck and stood for a long moment in the flat afternoon light, not speaking, just reading. She watched his face. She watched his eyes travel the blue line from the mountain to the X, watched them stop on the block letters. And she watched something move through the old man's expression that was not surprise. What moved through him was something older than surprise. It was recognition. It was grief. "Where'd you find this?" he said. His voice had changed. Hidden behind the lining in his case, there was a note with it. She handed him the note. He read it once fast, then again slow, his lips moving slightly. When he finished, he pressed the heel of one hand against his eye for a moment. 30 years, he said, low, to himself more than to her. 30 years I told that stubborn man to let it go. Watch the valley call him names at the feed store. Watch people laugh behind his back at the diner. His own daughter-in-law stopped believing him. He paused. And the whole time he had this. He looked up. His eyes were wet and he did not hide it. Your grandfather wasn't chasing water, Calla. He was keeping a promise. To who? To his father, and his father's father before that. Gideon looked up at the mountain. You know how there came to be a ranch here at all. The first Mercer who came into this valley wasn't looking for grass or good bottomland. He was following water. Found a seep high on the eastern face up in that narrow canyon past the high pasture. Everyone else who tried to settle this basin had given up because the summers were too dry. He found one wet spot on a rock face and saw a home. He dug that spring out by hand, lined it with stone, built a collection system over it, a cistern to hold what it gave. Then in 1911, his son, your great-great-grandfather, ran a steel flume across the canyon to feed the cistern properly. When the valley started filling in with settlers, the Mercers ran a gravity line down to anyone who asked. Never charged a cent, not once in 50 years. Calla had not known any of this. What happened to it? Wells got cheap, pumps got cheap. Everybody put a windmill over their own hole, and the old system just stopped being necessary. The brush grew up over the canyon mouth. A rock slide closed the entrance further. Out of sight, out of mind. He folded his hands over the edge of the map. But Angus, his father, made him swear before he died that he'd never let it go to nothing, never let it be lost. And Angus kept that oath for 40 years, while everybody around him decided it meant he was broken somehow, that he couldn't accept reality. He shook his head. There's a difference between a man who can't accept reality and a man who can see further into it than the people around him. Your grandfather knew the difference. He just couldn't make anybody else see it. Calla's throat was tight. She said, "Can you read the numbers, the margins? I can read the shape of the map, but not the figures." Gideon smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile since he'd arrived, and it changed his whole face. "Girl," he said, "I shot half these lines myself. I held the rod on this map before either of us had gray in our hair." He reached back through the open window of his truck and pulled out a battered cardboard accordion folder, swollen soft at the edges, tied shut with a bootlace. He set it on the hood next to the map. "I've been carrying this thing for 12 years, he said. "Couldn't throw it out. Couldn't do a blessed thing with it either." He worked the lace loose. "This is the report that broke this valley. The 2012 aquifer study, the one Elspeth quotes at your mother. The one the bank swears by. It says the water's gone, the aquifer is exhausted, the valley's done. The company paid for it, handed it to the county like a gift, and the county stamped it, and after that it was fact." He drew out a thick gray document, printed, official, charts and graphs, and the state seal on the cover. Beside it, he set a field notebook, thin the cover rubbed to something close to silk from years of handling. "Your grandfather's working notes," Gideon said. "I kept them after, when things went bad for him." He opened the gray report to its map page, grid printed precise with small marks showing where the test drills had been sunk. Then he opened the field notebook to a hand-drawn map of the same terrain. He put one thick finger on the printed map, put another on the notebook page. "Here is where the company drilled to prove the water was gone," he said. He moved his finger on the field notebook map. "And here is where your great-great-grandfather's cistern has been sitting for 113 years. He moved the finger across the space between the two marks. It was not a large space, on the map maybe an inch. "Half a mile," Calla said. "Half a mile." His voice had gone very quiet. Every single test hole they sank was half a mile off the canyon, on the hardpan flats, in the one place anyone with a basic understanding of local geology would know the water can't surface. He looked at her. "That is not a coincidence." The screen door banged. "Calla!" Petra's voice sharp at the edges. "What is that? What are you two doing out here?" She was coming across the yard fast, looking at the papers spread across the hood of Gideon's truck, and her face had gone pale in the way it went pale when something threatened to undo all the careful holding together she had been doing for years. "It's mine," Gideon said. He stepped forward not to hide anything, just to put himself between the papers and her first arrival to give the moment a breath. He came to the only man who'd know what he'd found. "Don't land on her for that." "I know what that is." Petra's voice was thin and bright, the way metal gets when you stress it. "That's the map. That's the water. That's the thing that cost this family 20 years and 2 men and every dollar Angus ever put aside." She looked at the papers the way you look at something that has burned you before. "I will not watch it take my daughter." "Mama," Calla said, "look at it. Just look." "I have looked. I've been looking since before you were born." Petra's eyes were bright, and she kept them steady by what looked like will alone. Your grandfather spent the back half of his life being laughed at in this valley for that map. And your grandmother watched it happen, and then she was gone, and your father watched it happen, and then she stopped, pressed her lips together, pressed. I will not do that to you, she said. I won't. I'm signing at the end of the month. She held out her hand. Give me the map, Calla. The yard went quiet. Even Buck lifted his head from where he had settled by the fence post. Calla looked at her mother's outstretched hand. She looked at the map on the hood of the truck, the blue line worn dark from the pencil going over it again and again across 30 years of believing. She looked at the note with its shaky letters and its iron brand signature. She thought about the spring before the fall, when her grandfather's mind began to slip. She thought about him sitting somewhere in this house, hands already uncertain, still finding a way to put down the thing he needed to say. She thought about the cottonwood, standing green on a dead mountain, for 4 dry years and 40 before that, and 100 before those. No, Calla said. She had never said it that way to her mother before. Not flat like that, not down to the ground. She saw it land, saw it hurt, held the map anyway. Into the silence, Gideon Pruitt spoke, and his voice was quiet and level with nothing left in it but the plain weight of an old man who had carried something too long and was setting it down. Dana, before you sign one thing, let me show you one thing. Then I'll go, and I'll never say another word about it if that's what you want. He laid the gray report open to the map page and the field notebook open beside it, and he put one finger on each the way he had done for Calla. This is where the company drilled, he said. This is where the water is, 1/2 mile apart, on purpose. He let that sit. The wind moved across the yard, lifted the corner of the gray report, and let it drop. Petra looked at the 2 marks for a long time, long enough that the quality of her silence began to change. Say you're right, she said finally. Her voice had gone to something quieter, something that was not surrender, but was not certainty either. Say there's water up there. We can't drill. We can't afford a lawyer to fight a company that bought the county's own study. We have 3 weeks and $40 and 7 cows. What do I do with a 1/2 mile? Gideon had no answer to that. She could see it cost him something to admit it. I don't know, he said, but I know what Angus would say. Start with what's true. The rest will follow or it won't. Petra looked at him, then at Calla, then at the map. Angus is dead, she said. It came out rougher than she meant. She pressed her mouth flat. I'm sorry, but he is. And I have to keep his granddaughter fed and in school, and I can't do that on a promise made to people in the ground. She turned and walked back toward the house. The screen door closed behind her. Not slammed, just closed, which was somehow worse. Gideon let out a long breath. He began folding the papers careful the way you fold something you mean to keep. That's it, Calla said. Did I say that? He handed her the map and kept the gray report. Your mother is not wrong. Paper doesn't beat paper. A company lawyer would have this thing tied up until you're 40. But there is one thing a lawyer cannot argue with. One thing your mother cannot put in a box. He looked up at the mountain, at the dark fold of the canyon on the eastern face. Real water, he said, coming up out of the ground where the map says it'll be, with people watching. He looked at her. We don't need to win an argument. We need to find the spring. The girl sitting on the fence by the property line had been there the whole time. Calla had noticed her earlier and said nothing, the way you say nothing about the neighbor's kids sitting on a fence because you have bigger things pressing. Now with Gideon's truck moving slowly back toward the highway and the yard quiet again, she looked at the girl properly for the first time. 13 years old, maybe. Slight with dark hair cut short and practical, and eyes that took in more than they gave back. Sitting on the top rail with her boots hooked on the second patient and still in the way that only children who have learned to wait know how to be. Calla walked over. You're Lena Harwick, she said. Your family's place is the section east of us. Was, the girl said. We signed the papers 3 days ago. We're supposed to be gone by the 15th. Calla looked at her. You don't want to go? No. said flat and simple without complaint in it, just fact. My dad taught me this land before he left. Every fence line and every water cut and every name for every draw and ridge. I know where everything is. She looked out at the valley. I don't want to leave and have all that just be something I used to know. Calla understood that. She understood it in her bones. You were listening, she said. Yes. For how long? Since Mr. Pruitt got out of his truck. Calla thought about that. Then your dad taught you to read maps. The girl's chin came up slightly. Topographic and survey. He said it was the most useful thing he could pass on. Said if you could read a map, you could never be truly lost. Calla looked at her for a moment longer. Can you read bearing figures, azimuth notation? Yes. Then go home and ask your mother if you can spend the morning here tomorrow. Tell her we're going to walk the high pasture. Lena Harwick looked at her steadily. Are we going further than the high pasture? Calla thought about the blue line on the map, about the X in the canyon she had never entered, about the cistern her great-great-grandfather had built by hand in a narrow slot of rock 113 years ago, about the cottonwood that had been drinking from something nobody else could find for longer than anyone living could remember. Maybe, she said. Lena nodded once as if this confirmed something she had already decided. I'll be here before sunrise, she said, and she climbed down off the fence and went home through the brown grass, and the evening came down over the valley, and the lights in the houses that were left came on one by one, and Calla stood at the fence until she could not see the girl anymore. Then she went inside and took the map to her room and sat at the desk her grandfather had built when she was 7 and spread it flat under the lamp. The blue line ran from the mountain to the X. 30 years of going over it, the pencil line darkened to near black. The margins crowded with figures she could not read. Bearings and elevations and notations in the tight shorthand of a surveyor who had expected to be the one using them. She traced the blue line with one finger, from the mountain to the X, from the living tree to the thing still waiting under the rock. She looked at it for a long time. Outside, the valley was dark and quiet, and the stars were coming out over the mountain. And somewhere on the eastern face, in a fold of rock that 80 years of brush had hidden from every eye, but one the old spring was doing what springs do. It was waiting. It had been waiting for a very long time. And Calla Mercer, 20 years old, alone in her grandfather's house, with his map in her hands and his dog at her door, had just decided she was going to make it stop. They left before sunrise. Not because Calla had planned it that way, but because she had not slept, and at 4 in the morning the lying still became unbearable, and she got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the dark, and the dark watched her back. Lena was at the gate when Calla stepped outside, already there, sitting on the fence post with her boots hanging loose and a canteen strapped across her chest, and the bearing notebook she had apparently made herself, small pages covered in her own tight handwriting tucked under one arm. 13 years old, before sunrise, ready. Calla looked at her. Lena looked at Calla. You brought a notebook, Calla said. I made a copy of the margin figures last night, so we don't have to keep unfolding the original. Calla stared at her for a moment. Then she handed her the canteen and said nothing more about it because there was nothing more to say. They did not tell anyone where they were going. Gideon's knees could not manage the terrain, and her mother was still sleeping. And the truth was, Calla did not want either of them there for this first part. This part was between her and the mountain and the dead man who had mapped it, and the blue line that had been waiting in the dark for 30 years. Some things you have to do alone before you can do them with anyone watching. Buck trotted ahead through the dead grass. The pre-dawn air had a cold edge to it, the kind that burns clean inside your lungs if you breathe it all the way down. The stars were still out on the western edge of the sky. The east was just beginning to turn the color of old iron. The high pasture was dead. All of it. Brown wire grass that snapped underfoot instead of bending. Stock ponds reduced to rings of cracked, pale mud. fence posts standing in rows with nothing useful between them. 4 years had done this. 4 years of the kind of dry that does not feel like weather anymore. That starts to feel like the land's decision. Calla had grown up on this pasture. She had run these fence lines with her grandfather from the time she was old enough to hold a staple gun. She knew every rock and every draw and every hollow the way you know a place that has shaped you. And she had never once walked into the canyon on the eastern face, because there had been no reason to, because the canyon walls pressed close and the entrance was hidden by decades of brush, and because from the outside it looked like nothing. A shadow in the rock, a crease, a place the eye slid off without catching, which was exactly what someone had wanted. Not someone, her great-great-grandfather, who had built something in there and then let the country hide it slowly year by year because the country was a better guardian than any lock. They reached the cottonwood as the sky went gray gold. It stood where it had always stood, on the brown shoulder of the hill where the pasture gave way to the rocky slope that climbed toward the eastern face. Enormous and green and wrong. Every other tree on that hillside had given up years ago. The willows in the dry creek bed were sticks. The scrub oak had dropped its leaves 2 months early. Even the old juniper by the fence corner had gone gray at the tips. And here was this one cottonwood full-leafed and alive, making a sound like soft rain when the morning breeze moved through it. Green right down to the ends of its branches, as if the drought were a rumor it had heard and decided not to believe. Calla put her hand flat against the bark, the way her grandfather had taught her. Not just touching, listening. The way you listen to something that has been saying the same thing for 100 years and is perfectly patient about the fact that no one has been paying attention. She crouched at the base of the trunk and pushed her fingers into the dirt. 3 inches down it was cold. Not damp. Cold, the mineral cold of water that has traveled a long way through rock to get here. The cold of something deep. Something that does not care about the surface and what the surface is doing. Something moving at its own pace, in its own dark. She sat back on her heels and looked up through the green leaves at the pale sky, and felt for the first time since she had stood in the funeral home and tried to hold her face in the right shape, something other than the pressing weight. Then she pulled out the map and the feeling steadied into something more careful, because she could read the shape of the map, the mountain, the high pasture, the blue line, the X. What she could not read alone was the numbers. First bearing, Lena said, already crouching beside her with the notebook open. North 22 degrees east, 240 feet. She looked up at the slope above them. That's a direction and a distance. You walk it, I'll track. Calla looked at the girl. The girl looked back, patient, unhurried. Your dad really did teach you, Calla said. He said a map is just a conversation with the land. You have to know the language. Calla stood, turned to face north, 22 east. The slope was loose rock and dead grass, and the kind of footing that asked you to pay attention or pay the consequences. 240 feet, she said. About 80 of your steps, Lena said. If your stride runs 3 feet. She walked it, counted. At 80 steps, she stopped and turned back, and Lena raised a hand, and they went to the next bearing. Direction and distance. Direction and distance. The dead language of the map becoming step by step a path through the actual country. Because that was what a survey was. Somebody had walked this ground before her. Somebody had stood where she was standing and looked through a transit and written down numbers, and those numbers were now pointing her home. Her grandfather had walked every step of this, and before him his father, and before his father the first Mercer who had come into this valley following a seep of water on a dry rock face and decided that was reason enough to build a life. She was just the next one walking. The fifth bearing took them off the open slope and toward the base of the eastern face. The rock here was dark basalt, old and dense, shot through with the pale lines of ancient intrusions. The face ran north-south for about a quarter mile, unbroken to casual eyes. A wall. but the sixth bearing pointed directly at a section of wall that was slightly set back from the others. And at the base of that section, when you were close enough to see it, there was a slot. Not a gap exactly, a compression, like the rock had leaned in from both sides and not quite met. 3 feet wide at the base, narrowing as it went up, filled with 80 years of catclaw and mesquite. Buck went straight to it. He did not hesitate, did not sniff it out or circle it or do any of the things dogs do when they are uncertain. He just went moving through the thorns with the ease of an animal who had been here before, who had some knowledge of this place that was older than memory stored in the body instead of the mind. Calla watched him disappear into the slot. She looked at Lena. "How far does the bearing go?" she asked. Lena checked the notebook. "Inside the canyon. The next mark is 40 feet in." Calla looked at the slot, at the thorns, at the dark beyond the thorns. Then she pulled the cuffs of her jacket down over her wrists and went in. The cat claw was exactly as described by its name. It caught, it held, it tore. She moved through it sideways, and then at angles, and then just forward, letting it take what it wanted from the jacket and the back of her hands, because getting through was worth more than getting through clean. 20 feet in the slot opened. Not wide, maybe 8 feet across. But the walls pulled back to vertical, and the thorn growth thinned, and the floor was dark sand and flat stone, and the feeling of the air changed. Cooler, noticeably cooler, the kind of cool that does not come from shade alone, that comes from below. She stopped, stood still, breathed, because something was rising off the floor of this canyon. Something that was not quite a smell and not quite a feeling, but was somewhere between the two. The mineral breath of deep earth, the exhalation of rock that had water moving through it. She had read about this. Her grandfather had described it once in that flat, careful way he described things he had felt himself and knew to be true. Said when you're close to a pressurized aquifer near the surface, you feel it before you see it. The air tells you. People who don't believe in water witching believe in that much. The air tells you. The air was telling her. She pushed her fingers into the sand. Wet. Not damp. Not the residual moisture of a morning with dew on the ground. Wet. Cold and dark, and present the sand holding water. The way sand does when there is water moving underneath it. When the water table is not somewhere theoretical far below, but right there. Right under your hand. Lena. One word, her voice came out strange, smaller than she meant. Lena was already beside her, had come through the thorns without being asked, and was crouching in the sand a foot away. She pushed her own hand in, drew it back. Dark fingers, shining. They looked at each other. Lena's face did the thing faces do when the thing you hoped was true turns out to be. Not joy exactly, something quieter. The expression of someone who had been holding their breath and was finally carefully letting it out. "It's real," Lena said. And then in a voice that cracked only at one edge, "Calla, it's real." Calla could not speak. She pressed her hand flat against the wet sand and stayed there, the cold moving up through her palm, the canyon walls pressing close overhead, the thin strip of pale morning sky above, and the silence of 113 years holding. She thought of him writing the note with shaking hands, still knowing, still certain, with his mind beginning to go and the valley calling him a fool, and his body failing, and his time running out, still absolutely certain. Not because he was stubborn, not because he couldn't let go, because he had been here. Because he had put his hand in the same sand, in the same canyon, in the same cold. Because he had felt what she was feeling right now, and there is no argument that will make that untrue once you have felt it. She sat back in the wet sand. Let it come, the sting behind her eyes, the tightness in her throat. She did not fight it, and she was not ashamed of it, and it lasted about 30 seconds, and then she got it under control because there was more to do. "The cistern," she said. "The X is further in. 40 feet past the entrance mark, Lena said. She was already on her feet, already checking the notebook. 13 years old and calm in the canyon like she was meant to be here. Maybe she was. Maybe some places choose who can see them. They went deeper in. The canyon widened slightly as they went, and then narrowed again, and then the walls pulled back into a small pocket, maybe 20 feet across. The floor was sand and flat rock, and the root systems of plants that had no business being alive at the surface had come down through the cracks in the rock floor and buried themselves in the dark below. And on the far side of the pocket, set into the base of the canyon wall, stone. Cut stone. Not natural, not the rough face of the basalt walls. Cut, shaped, individual pieces fitted together without mortar, each one shaped to meet the next, the joins tight as a handshake. A low curved wall following the line of the canyon floor built to cradle something, black with age and green with moss in the joints. 100 years of wet. Tool marks. She could see them when she got close. The marks of the implement that had shaped each face. Regular, deliberate. The evidence of hours of work, of someone who had come here with tools and intention and had made something that was meant to last. Her great-great-grandfather, with a pick and whatever else he could carry up a mountain. She thought of her grandfather's voice, a thing he used to say standing in front of fences he had built decades before. The post still straight, the wire still true. Said a man is not gone while his work is standing. She put both hands on the top of the cut stone and felt it solid under her palms. Not going anywhere. Not after 113 years. Not after 4 dry years on the surface. Not after everything the valley had thrown at the family that built it. Standing. Still standing. The cold air rose off it in a steady stream, not a draft, a breath. The deep earth breathing through the gap in the stone cap. Water below. Pressure below. Something alive in the dark below the stone waiting to come up. Lena was beside her with her hand on the stone, said quietly, the map called it a cistern. It's more than that, Calla said, and she knew it without being able to say why. Because a cistern just collects. This had been built to receive something, to hold something that was coming from somewhere. A pressurized source that fed directly into the collection, not just gathering rain, receiving the mountain. She stood in the cold pocket of the canyon with her hands on the cut stone her family had made and felt the whole thing in her chest like a struck bell, the vibration of it, the note it made. Her grandfather had been right. He had been right the whole time. They came down off the mountain in the late morning, scratched from the cat claw and smelling of wet stone and deep earth, and Gideon Pruitt's truck was in the yard. And next to it, Wade Elspeth's white truck. Calla stopped at the edge of the yard. Wade was on the porch with her mother, hat in his hands, talking in that careful, reasonable voice. And her mother was listening with her arms crossed but her face uncertain, which was worse than certain in any direction. Gideon was standing by his truck. He saw Calla and Lena coming across the dead grass and his eyes went to their hands. The dark stain of the wet sand still on Calla's palms. The scratch lines from the cat claw on both their wrists. He read it in one look. He said nothing. Just turned and walked to the porch slowly, the bad knees taking the steps one at a time. "Morning, Wade," he said. Wade Elspeth turned. He looked at Gideon, then at Calla coming across the yard, then at Lena behind her, then at Calla's hands. He was good. She would give him that. Whatever moved behind his eyes stayed behind his eyes. "Calla," he nodded. "Lena, you two been up the back section." "Family property," Gideon said. "Family business." "Of course." Easy, untroubled. "I grew up hearing about the back section. Angus took me up there once years ago, showed me the green tree, told me the same thing he told everyone." He turned his hat in his hands. The gesture she had started to understand was not nervousness, but something more calculated, a way of looking like he was being open. I felt for the man, honest. A person can want something so much it costs them everything else. Or a person can be right, Gideon said, and get charged the same price for being right as other people pay for being wrong, which is its own kind of robbery. Wade looked at him. The patience in his face had taken on a quality she hadn't seen before. Careful, assessing. "The 30th is coming," he said. He looked at Petra, not at Calla, at her mother. "I'd hate to see this family hold out for something that's going to cost them their last option. I really would. That's not what I want for any of you." "That's kind of you," Petra said. Her voice was measured. Wade nodded, set his hat on his head, looked up the mountain once. Just once. Something moved across his face. Quick. She almost missed it. She didn't miss it. He came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to his truck and drove out without hurrying, and the dust went up behind him and hung in the dry air long after the truck was gone. Calla waited until the dust was settled. Then she said, "He knows." Gideon looked at her. The way he looked up there, he wasn't doing it to make a point. He did it without thinking. She watched the place where the truck had been. "He knows the canyon is there." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He knows enough to be watching," he said, "and a man who's watching and has a deadline tends to move. So we move first. So we move first." Her mother had come down off the porch. She looked at Calla's hands, at the dark stain on the palms, at the scratch marks from the thorns, at the way Calla was standing, which was different from how she had been standing 3 weeks ago. Something had shifted in the architecture of it. The way you carry yourself changes when you found the thing you were looking for, and it turned out to be real. "You went in the canyon," Petra said. "Yes." "And?" Calla looked at her mother, at the careful, controlled face of a woman who had been managing her hope the way you manage a fire you can't afford to let get away from you. "There's wet sand, Mama, in a drought that's killed everything for 20 miles. Wet sand and cold air rising off cut stone that somebody built 100 years ago." Petra's face did not change. Exactly. But something in the set of it shifted. Almost nothing. Almost invisible. "That's not proof," she said. "I know." Calla held her mother's gaze. "You said show you water. Real water. I need one more day to do that. I need you to give me one more day before you call anyone." Petra looked at her daughter for a long moment. At the 20-year-old standing in the dead yard of a failing ranch with dark sand on her hands and a thing in her eyes that Petra Mercer had not seen there before. Had seen somewhere else before. In a man. In the eyes of a man she had watched spend 30 years being called a fool and been right. "One day," Petra said. That night, Lena sat at Calla's kitchen table with Gideon's accordion folder spread in front of her and a cup of tea she had made herself without asking because that was the kind of person she was. Calla was at the counter. Gideon was in the armchair by the window. Petra was in her room not sleeping in the particular way that people are not sleeping when you can still hear them moving. The papers were spread across the table. The 2012 report, Angus's field notebook, the photographs Gideon had taken over the years of the aquifer test hole locations. Lena went through them methodically, not fast, carefully, reading each page the way her father had taught her to read a map, looking for what was actually there instead of what she expected to find, which was why she found it. At 20 minutes past 10, she stopped, stared at a page, turned it over, turned it back. Calla. Something in the one word brought Calla across the kitchen immediately. Lena was holding a single sheet of paper. Thin, slightly discolored, the printing on it faded. A fax header at the top. The kind of internal communication document that ends up in files by accident because someone put it in the wrong folder because bureaucracies are vast and paper is cheap and things get lost. Or almost lost. The fax header read received, internal distribution only. The date was 2010, 2 years before the published report. The content was a single line acknowledging receipt of a document described as pre-survey confidential Harlan Valley Hydrology Phase 1. Phase 1, Lena said. This is a receipt for a document that came before the 2012 report. A document that isn't in this folder. Calla stared at it. Because it's not here. Because someone removed it. Lena looked up. Her eyes were steady. 13 years old and completely steady. But they forgot the receipt, or didn't know it was in here, or both. Because bureaucracies are vast, and paper gets lost. And a 13-year-old girl with nothing to lose, and a father who taught her to read documents the way you read land to look for what's actually there, instead of what you're told is there, had just found the thread. Calla took the fax receipt and held it and looked at it for a long time. A Phase 1 survey. 2 years before the published report, which meant before the company told the county the water was gone, they had run their own assessment. To know for themselves what they were buying, which meant they had known. Before the report said the aquifer was exhausted, someone had the document that said what was really under the ground. And that document was not in the folder. And the folder had been in Gideon Pruitt's truck for 12 years, and before that had come from Angus Mercer's own hands, which meant the document had never been in the folder, which meant it had been removed before the folder left company hands, which meant someone had kept it. Someone still had it. She set the receipt on the table. She looked at Gideon. He was reading the receipt over her shoulder, now his face very still. "Wade Elspeth," she said. Not a question. "He's been the company's face in this valley for 15 years, Gideon said slowly. He would have had access to everything. He would have been the one filing the operational documents. He'd know where the original survey is. He'd know exactly where it is." Calla thought about the way Wade had looked up at the mountain. Just once. Without thinking. The thing that moved behind his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He knew. Not just about the canyon. About the survey. About all of it. He had been carrying it for years. She had seen it on him. The weight of it. The way a man looks when he has been keeping something he knows he should not be keeping. People called her grandfather a fool for 30 years. And Wade Elspeth had known for how long that he was not. Had known and come around to houses in a clean truck to talk families into leaving. She picked up the fax receipt, held it, felt the thin paper between her fingers. The small, accidental thing that told the truth by existing at all. Tomorrow she would call Dr. June Ferris and take her up the canyon and let the earth make its own argument. That had to come first. The water had to speak for itself before anyone else could speak about it. But after that, she was going to go to Wade Elspeth's office in town and set this piece of paper on his desk and ask him one question. And she thought she already knew what the answer would look like on his face before he said a word. Gideon left before midnight. Lena had fallen asleep at the kitchen table with her cheek on her notebook, the fax receipt still in front of her, and Calla draped a blanket over her shoulders and let her stay. She went to the window. The valley was dark. The lights in the houses that were left were out. 3 weeks ago, there had been 8. Now there were 4. One by one, like the stock pond rings closing in, people had loaded their trucks and driven away from the only thing they had. Because a piece of paper said the water was gone. Because someone had needed them to believe that. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and looked out at the mountain. Dark against darker. The canyon invisible from here. The stone wall inside it invisible. The wet sand invisible. The cold breath of deep water rising through cut stone invisible. All of it invisible to everyone who had not walked through the thorns to find it. She thought about her grandfather writing the note. Hands shaking, time running short, still believing. Not because belief was easy or comfortable or free, but because he had been there. Because you cannot unknow a thing you have felt in your own hands. She thought about the fax receipt on the table behind her, the small forgotten thing, the thread. She thought about Lena asleep at the kitchen table, 13 years old, who had found it because she read every page instead of assuming she knew what she would find. Outside, far up the slope, she could not see in the dark, The cottonwood was standing in whatever remained of the night breeze, its leaves making that sound. Soft rain. The only sound of water in miles. Drinking, patient, certain. She had one more day before the deadline started to close in around them like the canyon walls. One more day to do what the mountain had been waiting 100 years for someone to do. She was going to make it enough. Calla called Dr. June Ferris at 7 in the morning. Not through the county office, not through any official channel that would take 3 days and a form. She had found the number the night before in the state hydrologist directory, the one posted publicly on the county website, the one that was there for exactly this kind of situation, even if nobody ever used it this way. She called the direct line. It rang 4 times. She was already preparing to leave a message, already planning what to say in 30 seconds that would not sound like a 20-year-old girl with a dead grandfather in a desperate map. Then someone picked up. Ferris. Dr. Ferris, my name is Calla Mercer. I'm calling from the Harlan Valley East Section, Mercer Ranch. I have a confined aquifer venting at a natural outcrop in a canyon on the eastern face of our property. I have wet sand at 0 to 3 inches depth in the middle of a 4-year drought. I have cut stone from a collection cistern built in 1911 that is still receiving pressurized flow. And I have a 12-year-old aquifer study that I believe placed every test hole half a mile from the actual source. Silence. Just long enough for Calla to think she had lost her. Then send me the GPS coordinates. I'll be there by 10. June Ferris was younger than Calla had expected, maybe 40, possibly less. She drove a county truck that had seen real-use mud in the wheel wells instrument cases, bungeed in the bed, a jacket thrown across the passenger seat with what looked like a field manual sticking out of the pocket. She did not say much when she arrived. She shook Calla's hand, shook Gideon's hand, looked at Lena with the particular attention adults give children who are clearly there for a reason they haven't been told yet. You found the fax receipt, she said to Lena. Lena blinked. How did you know I found anything? Because the way you're standing says you found something. Ferris picked up her instrument case. Hydrology teaches you to read what's actually in front of you instead of what you expected to see. It's the most useful skill I own. She looked at Calla. Show me the canyon. They went up the mountain. Ferris did not talk on the climb. She observed. The cottonwood on the brown shoulder of the hill stopped her for 2 minutes. She put her hand against the bark the way Calla had done, pushed her fingers into the dirt at the base, did not say anything. But she took out her field notebook and wrote something. The ledge through the cat claw slot she navigated without complaint. The thorns took their toll on her jacket. She did not appear to notice. And when they came through into the pocket of the canyon, when she felt the cold air rising off the wet sand and the cut stone, she stopped. And for a moment, she was very still. Then she set down her case and opened it and went to work. She measured. She lowered an instrument into the narrow gap in the stone cap on a calibrated tape and read the numbers off into her notebook. The flow she caught in a small container in time with her phone. Glass bottles got filled and labeled and stood in a rack. She tested temperature. She tested pressure differential. She moved methodically and without hurry, and when Gideon started to say something, she held up one finger without looking up, and he closed his mouth and waited. 40 minutes. That was how long it took. Then she capped the last sample bottle, straightened, pushed her hat back, looked at the cut stone and the wet sand and the cold air still rising off the dark gap in the earth, looked at the 3 of them. I'll be careful how I say this, she said, because I don't traffic in hope. So I'll just tell you what the instruments say and you can draw your own conclusions. She looked at her notebook. This is not a seep. It is not runoff collected in a low point. It is not a perched water table. This is a confined aquifer under hydrostatic pressure venting at a natural fracture zone. The flow rate has not changed in the 40 minutes I have been standing here, which in a 4-year drought means it is drawing on a deep recharge source that is entirely disconnected from surface precipitation. Deep, old, stable. Silence. Gideon's hands were very still at his sides. How much water? Petra said. She had come up the mountain without being asked an hour after the rest of them. Nobody had told her to stay behind. Ferris looked at her levelly. That is the part you should sit down for. Except there is nowhere to sit. So I'll just say it. She looked at the canyon walls, at the thin strip of sky above. A source like this, at this pressure and this elevation, does not feed one ranch. It feeds a valley. If the recharge zone maps the way I think it maps based on the pressure differential and the temperature differential and the mineral content of what I just bottled, the sustainable yield of this system is enough to supply the entire Harlan Valley and the 3 drainage basins below it. For decades. Calla heard her mother make a sound. Not words, just a sound. The sound of a woman who has been holding a door shut for a very long time, and the door has just moved. Your grandfather, Ferris said, looking at Calla, did not find a well. He found the reason there is a valley here at all. She paused. And someone spent a substantial amount of money making sure no one else ever did. Gideon let out a breath that had been building since 2012. Said very quietly, he used to say if folks had eyes, they'd never need a map at all. Ferris looked at him. Said turns out they just needed someone willing to follow one. Then she opened the gray 2012 report that Calla had carried up in her pack, and she read for 7 minutes without looking up, turning to the map page, finding the test hole locations, looking at them, then looking up at the canyon, then back at the page, then running the arithmetic in her head that Gideon had run on the hood of his truck a week ago. When she looked up, her face had gone somewhere particular. Not angry, not surprised, something colder than both. They tested the hard pan flats, she said. Every single test hole. In the one place any first-year student would know the confined system cannot surface. The outcrop is here. The hard pan is there. No one who knows basic regional geology puts 8 test holes on the hard pan by accident. She closed the report. Someone chose this. The white truck was in the yard when they came down. Calla saw it from the slope and her stomach went tight, and then went to something else. Something that was not fear. Something that had more bone in it than fear. She kept walking. Wade Elspeth was standing at the porch steps. Not on the porch, at the steps. Like he wasn't sure of his welcome. Like the particular calibration of ease he had carried through every previous visit had developed a small but significant fault. He looked at the group coming down the slope, at the instrument case, at the county truck in the drive, at June Ferris, who he clearly recognized, at Calla, who he clearly had been thinking about. Dr. Ferris, he said. Wade, she said. Flat, professional. The voice of someone who knows someone by reputation and has been forming opinions about that reputation. He turned to Calla. I heard you called the county. I called a hydrologist, Calla said, because there is water in the canyon and it needed someone to measure it. And she looked at him for a moment. It's real, she said. You already knew that. The ease left his face, not all at once. Gradually. The way ice leaves a surface when the temperature has turned but hasn't finished turning. Calla. You looked up at that mountain every time you came to this house, and she said, not because you were being polite, because you were checking whether we'd found it, checking how close we were, because you already knew it was there. Wade Elspeth turned his hat in his hands, once, then stopped, said nothing. I have something to ask you, Calla said, and I'd like you to answer it before I say anything else. She reached into her jacket and took out the fax receipt, the thin, faded paper that Lena had found in the accordion folder at 20 minutes past 10 the night before. The small, forgotten thing. She held it out. He looked at it, and the looking at it told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. Because his face did not show confusion, did not show the slight widening of the eyes that genuine surprise produces. What moved across his face was recognition, And behind the recognition, something heavier, something that had been waiting. The pre-survey, Calla said, the Phase 1 document, the one that came before the 2012 report, the one that isn't in the folder that Angus Mercer kept for 12 years. I need to know if it still exists. Wade Elspeth looked at the fax receipt for a long time. Then he looked at Calla, said, I need a day. She looked at him. You have until tomorrow morning, she said, because Dr. Ferris is filing her findings with the county today. And whatever comes after that comes faster than either of us can control. If there's something you want to do before that happens tomorrow morning is when you do it. He nodded, once, small, and got in his white truck and drove out. Gideon stood beside Calla and watched the truck go. Said, you think he'll come? I think he's been trying to figure out how to come for 6 years, Calla said. And I think yesterday he finally decided. Ferris filed her findings that afternoon. Not quietly, with full documentation, with the aquifer pressure readings in the flow rate, in the temperature differentials, in the mineral analysis, in the GPS coordinates of the cistern, in the GPS coordinates of every 2012 test hole, and the calculated distance between them. She attached Angus Mercer's original survey map, the one with the blue line, the one from the false back of the leather case. For the first time in 12 years, the county had 2 documents in its official record, and they said opposite things. And one of them had been made by a dead man who had been called a fool at the feed store for 30 years. And the other had been made by a living woman who had stood in the canyon and put her instruments in the water. Ferris was direct about which one she stood behind. Wade Elspeth came the next morning. He did not come in the white company truck. He came in an old brown pickup, the kind you buy used and don't expect too much from. No company logo, no folder under his arm, just a cardboard box in the bed. He carried it to the hood of Calla's truck and set it down and put his hand flat on the lid for a moment, like he was saying goodbye to something, or like he was making sure it was real before he let it go. Then he took the lid off. Inside, a bound document, older than the 2012 report. The paper slightly yellowed, the binding worn at the corners, no state seal, no county stamp, an internal document, the kind that never leaves company hands, except that it had, except that it was here. The company keeps everything, Wade said. Every study, every assessment, every internal memo. They keep it because someday a piece of paper might protect them. He looked at the box. 2 years before the 2012 report, they ran their own survey, quietly, for their own purposes, to know what they were actually buying before they made offers. He picked up the document and held it out to June Ferris. Their own people found the aquifer, he said, mapped it within a quarter mile of where the old man always said it was. Then they ordered the public report, told the drillers where to sink the holes, and filed the original survey in a storage room in the city where it would never see daylight. His voice was level, but it cost him something. I've known it was there for 6 years. I'm the one who filed it when I first came on. I found it in the archives my second week. He paused. I've been trying to work out what to do with that for 6 years. June Ferris took the document, opened it, read. Nobody hurried her. When she looked up, her face had gone to the hard, certain place it had gone in the canyon. Their own survey, she said, their own signatures, dated before the public report. She looked at Wade. You understand what handing me this does? I understand exactly what it does, he said. And I understand that a 13-year-old girl found the receipt for it in a folder full of papers a dead man kept for 12 years. And that made it considerably harder to keep telling myself I was waiting for the right moment. He looked at Calla. I grew up 40 miles south, he said. Place my family had, good ground. The wells went unreliable in a dry stretch when I was young. A man came around with a study that said the water had never been sustainable and a check that made it easy to stop fighting. We signed, we left. It took me 20 years to wonder if anyone ever went back and checked whether the study was true. He stopped. By the time I wondered, he said, I was the man with the check. Silence. The morning was still. The valley spread out below them, brown and dry and quiet. A hawk moved on a thermal above the eastern face. "My grandfather would have given you water," Calla said. "If your place ran dry, he gave it to everyone. He never charged a cent." Wade Elspeth stood there and took that, absorbed it the way you absorb something that does not have a good answer, nodded once and could not speak, and turned and walked back to his truck and got in and drove out. And this time, the dust that went up behind him felt different from every other time he had driven away from this place. It moved fast after that, the way a thing moves once the first stone is out of the wall. Ferris filed the pre-survey alongside her own findings. She did not file it quietly either. She attached a written analysis of the relationship between the pre-survey conclusions and the placement of the 2012 test holes, and her analysis used precise language in specific coordinates and the kind of measured professional certainty that is very difficult to argue with in a public record. Within 4 days, a second hydrologist came out from the state, confirmed the flow rates, confirmed the aquifer classification, stood in the canyon with instruments, and confirmed what the cut stone had been saying for 113 years. Within a week, a man from the state attorney's office arrived, spoke with Ferris, spoke with Gideon, spoke with Calla, asked to see the map. The original, the one from the false back of the leather case, the one with the blue line and the block letters pressed so hard into the paper they had nearly gone through. She handed it to him and watched him read it and watched him look at the signature, the A in the circle, the Mercer iron. He handled it the way people handle things that have survived longer than they were expected to. Then he handed it back, because it belonged to her. The contracts began to come apart. Every purchase agreement in the valley had been built on the foundation of the 2012 report. The families who had signed the Harwicks, the Deningers, the Palma family. At the north end, the old man on the section past the Cottonwood Ridge, who had shaken Calla's hand and not been able to speak. Every one of their agreements rested on a study the company had known was false before they commissioned it. A thing built on a false foundation does not stand. Not in court. The legal term was fraudulent inducement. Calla did not fully understand the legal term until later. What she understood in the moment was simpler. What she understood was that Lena Harwick's family was not leaving. She was standing in the yard when she understood it. When she got the call from Gideon, who had gotten the call from the county, she stood in the dead yard of the failing ranch and felt the ground under her feet, the way you feel ground when it suddenly means something different. When it changes from a thing you're afraid of losing to a thing that is simply yours. Buck pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head, said very quietly to nobody, "We're staying." Then she went to find Lena. The girl was at the fence line where she always was, sitting on the top rail, looking out at the valley with the expression of someone who had been doing arithmetic in their head and was waiting for the final number. Calla stopped in front of her. "Your family's contract is being voided," she said. "You're not going anywhere." Lena looked at her, then looked away, then looked back, said, "I know." Said, "I heard my mom on the phone this morning." Said, "She cried," which she doesn't do. Calla thought about Lena's mother standing at the kitchen counter crying, thought about the phone call, thought about the particular sound of a door that has been locked for a long time opening. Said, "Your dad taught you to read the map. In a way, he's why any of this worked." Lena was quiet for a moment. Said, "He left, but he left me something first." She looked out at the valley. "I think that's the most complicated thing I know about people. They can do both. They can leave and still leave something behind that matters." Calla had no answer for that, because it was too true and too hard and too earned for a 13-year-old to know it. She just stood at the fence beside her. The afternoon was warm and still, and somewhere far up the eastern face, the cottonwood was drinking patient certain exactly as it had been drinking since before either of them was born. They went to the cemetery on a Thursday, Calla and Petra in the late afternoon when the light went gold. The little fence plot on the rise behind the house where the Mercers had buried their people for as long as there had been Mercers in this valley. Two of the graves there were newer than the others. Angus Mercer, the dirt still raw and settling the stone not yet fully weathered in, and next to him, a grave 3 years older, Calla's father. The man she had spent 3 years being angry at for dying, which she understood now was the only way she had known to grieve him. Petra carried a jar, spring water, from the canyon cistern, cold and dark as iron in the glass the way old water is, water that has been underground a long time. She set it between the two stones, did not explain it, did not have to. She stood with her hands folded and looked at the stone with her husband's name on it for a long time. Said finally, you were wrong about the water. But you were right that a man has to be able to sleep at night. You were right that watching someone you love spend themselves on something nobody else can see is its own kind of drowning. I was too hard on you for leaving him to it. I was too hard on him for not letting you be. Her voice was very steady, the steadiness of someone who has been rehearsing this for years. They were both doing the same thing, she said, trying to hold on to something they loved, just pointing in different directions. Calla crouched and put her hand flat on her grandfather's stone, the way she put her hand on the bark of the cottonwood, listening, not for sound, for something underneath sound, said, I'm not angry at Dad anymore. And it surprised her how true it was when she said it out loud, how much space it left in her chest when the anger wasn't there. Said, he got tired, people do. When it's hard enough for long enough, people stop being able to believe the thing they used to believe. I understand that now. She looked at the jar of water between the stones. I just didn't want to be that. I'd rather be the one who keeps looking. Petra put her hand on Calla's head, left it there. They stayed until the light went, until the mountains went dark against the orange sky, and the first stars appeared, and the valley below them showed its scatter of lights, more lights than there had been 2 weeks ago. Houses that had started packing and had unpacked again. The water went out in May, on a Saturday, because Gideon said a thing like this ought to be done where people could see it. Half the valley came. Trucks parked in a line down the back road. People walked up to the new pipe junction at the head of the draw where the line Calla and her neighbors had laid through the spring ground, split off into the branches that served each section. There were folding tables with too much food, because ranch people cannot gather without bringing too much food, and children ran in the grass that a month ago had been bare dirt. Already the rains were making more difference than they had in 4 years. Already the ground was receiving them, because when water has a place to go below the surface, it takes the surface water with it, feeds the whole system, recharges what the drought took. The land was not fixed. It would take years, but it was receiving. Gideon made Calla be the one to open the valve at the head of the line. She tried to give it to him, said it should be his, or the valley's, or the dead man's who had mapped it. He wouldn't hear it, said, your hands, you dug it up, you open it. Go on now. So she stepped up to the valve. It was a standard gate valve on a 3-inch line. Nothing special, nothing that looked like the end of a 30-year argument or the beginning of whatever came next. She put both hands on the wheel, thought about her grandfather with his blue pencil, going over the line again and again until it was nearly black. 30 years of going over it. Not because he forgot where it was, because he needed it to be undeniable when someone finally looked. She thought about Lena at the kitchen table, 20 minutes past 10, reading every page. She thought about the cold rising off the wet sand in the dark of the canyon, the breath of something that had been waiting longer than any of them had been alive. She turned the wheel. The water went out into the valley, into the pipe that ran to the Hart place in the Denegers section, and the old neighbor's house 3 miles north, and the Palma family's barn, and a dozen other places. And at every one of those places, someone had a tap open and was waiting for what had not come in 4 years. Somewhere down the line, Calla never knew exactly where a woman she had never met was standing at her kitchen sink when the water came through. An older woman, she was told later, had lived in the valley her whole life, had stayed when everyone around her left the way you stay when you cannot imagine being anywhere else, even when staying costs you everything. She was standing at the sink when it came through, and she turned on the tap, and the water ran. And she put her hands under it and stood there and cried. Not sad crying, the other kind, the kind that has nowhere else to go. Calla heard about it later that day, and it stayed with her longer than anything else, even the things she thought would stay the longest, because that was the thing her grandfather had built for. Not the survey, not the map, not even the water itself. That woman, standing at her sink, with water running over her hands after 4 dry years. That was the promise he had kept. Gideon stood at the back of the crowd the way he had been standing at the back of things since the funeral. Calla found him there after the valve was open, and the pipes were filling, and the sound of water moving underground was beginning to reach them, even at the surface. A low hum in the earth. His eyes were wet. He was not pretending they weren't. She stood beside him, and they did not say anything for a while. Just listened to the water going out into the valley. The sound of something returning. Then he said, "Your grandfather would be insufferable right now. Being right does that to a man." Paused. Said, "Lucky he's not here to gloat. Although I expect he's gloating anyway." His voice cracked at the end of it, and he did not bother to cover the crack. And she reached over and took his arm and held on, and he let her. They stood there until the crowd started thinning, until the folding tables were being folded and the trucks were starting, until the valley went toward evening and the shadows came off the mountain long and blue. The company did not survive the daylight. Not that specific company, not under that name. Once Ferris's report was in the public record with the pre-survey stapled to the back of it, there was no version of events that held together. The contracts voided. The land went back. The money that had been paid for properties sold under false pretenses had to go somewhere, and where it went was decided in a courtroom Calla attended once, and then stopped attending because the part that mattered to her had never been in a courtroom. It had been in the canyon, in the wet sand, in the face of an old man realizing he had been right, in a girl at a kitchen table finding a piece of paper no one had meant to leave. The names above Wade Elspeth's in the company structure were spoken in rooms Calla never saw the inside of. Some of what was said in those rooms stuck. Some of it didn't. She stopped following it. It was not her work. Wade came out to the Mercer place on a cold morning in early spring, alone, in the brown truck with a shovel in the bed. He found Calla and Gideon down in the draw, laying the last section of the lateral line that would complete the community distribution system. He got out of the truck and stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at them. Said, "Heard you could use a hand." He looked uncertain, not the salesman's practiced ease, actually uncertain. The expression of a man unsure whether he was welcome in a place he once came to as an adversary. Said, "I'm not asking to be forgiven. I know what that is and is not worth. I just have 2 arms and I'd rather use them here than anywhere else." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into the truck bed and pulled out a spare pair of work gloves and tossed them across. Said, "Trench is that way. Mind your back. The ground's harder than it looks." And that was how Wade Elspeth spent that spring in a ditch, not being paid for it, carrying water to the people he had once come around to talk out of staying. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody needed to. Out in the valley, that kind of apology was the only kind anyone trusted, the kind you dig with your hands. Calla went up to the spring on the last warm evening before the autumn turned. Buck came with her. He always came with her. He was 11 and slower now, but he made the climb, and he made the ledge with careful dignity, and he crossed the narrow walkway along the canyon wall, the way he had been crossing it all spring and summer, because some places become familiar from being returned to. Inside the pocket of the canyon, the water was running the way it had been running since they opened the stone cap in the spring. Not a column. A steady, clean flow through the old channel her great-great-grandfather had cut. Moving without hurry, going where it had always been going down the mountain and out to the valley in whatever form it could find. The cistern was uncapped now, fitted with a proper intake screen, the flow properly gauged and monitored. June Ferris came out twice a month to read the instruments. The numbers had not dropped. Not once since the spring. Not in a summer that was still mostly dry. Not when the August heat came down like a hand on the back of your neck. The flow rate held, because deep water is not interested in the surface, in what the surface is doing. It moves on its own time, its own logic. Buck lay in his spot at the edge of the water, chin on the wet stone, eyes half closed, a dog with nowhere else to be. Calla sat beside him. She had the map. She always had the map. Not in a frame on a wall somewhere. In her jacket, folded in oilcloth the way he had folded it. Carried the way you carry something that is still in use. A map on a wall is a thing that is finished. This one wasn't. Because there were 3 drainage basins below the Harlan Valley that fed off this same system. 3 more valleys where the water was not gone, but where nobody had gone looking in the right places. 3 more places where the ground was waiting to tell the truth to anyone patient enough to read it. She did not know who would go to those places. Maybe her. Maybe Lena, in 10 years with a transit and a notebook and her father's understanding of the land made into something her own. Maybe someone who had not been born yet. Someone who would find a map someday in a box of things nobody else wanted. But the looking would happen, because that was how it worked. Because one person showed the next where to dig, and the next showed the one after, and the knowing did not die with the person who first had it. It traveled. The way water travels, underground, patient, indifferent to the dry years on the surface, going where physics sent it and staying where geology held it, and coming up when someone finally found the right place to ask. She opened the map and spread it flat on the rock beside her. The blue line, worn to near black from 30 years of going over it. The X, the block letters, live water the cistern holds. She traced the line with one finger. Thought about him doing the same thing for 30 years, not because he forgot where it was, because he needed it to stay real to him, because the valley kept telling him it wasn't there, and the paper kept telling him it wasn't there, and the only thing that stood against all of that was the feeling in his hands from the last time he had been here. And the tree, always the tree. She looked up at the canyon rim, could not see the cottonwood from here, but she knew where it was, could feel the direction of it the way you feel north by something below conscious thought. Still green, still drinking, still the most useful witness on the mountain. People thought a story like this was about water, about rights and records and what the law said happened to the truth when someone buried it in a storage room and called it classified. But Gideon had said it right that day on the mountain, the day before everything broke open. Real water doesn't leave. It goes somewhere, sits and waits, comes back when something makes room for it. Same as the other kind. The kind that passes between people. The kind you inherit from the dead and carry forward and pass on to someone younger who needs it more than you need to keep it. The kind that doesn't care about the dry years because it is not made of rain. Her grandfather had kept that kind running too, through 30 years of being called a fool, through the valley laughing and the paper saying wrong, and the man he loved most stopping speaking to him over it, through bad harvests and dry tanks and the count going from 200 head to 7, through his mind starting to go and his hands starting to shake and the time running short. He had kept it running, left it where someone with the sense to look would find it. She folded the map back into its oilcloth, tucked it into her jacket, put her hand in the water and let it move cold and clean through her fingers for a moment. Going where it had always gone, down off the mountain to the valley, to the people who had stayed, to the taps and the troughs and the tanks filling back up slow and steady, the way things fill when the source is real and the source is not going to stop. Buck raised his head and looked at her. She looked at him, said, "I know." And she stayed there until the stars came out over the canyon walls one at a time, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. A girl on her grandfather's land beside a spring with his map in her pocket. Home. Finally. For good.